some good news. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian army has now switched from desperate defence to attack and has launched an offensive in the south to recapture the area around the city of Kherson. Now, there's even a video apparently showing Russian soldiers retreating in the face of this advance, although Ukrainian commanders are begging the West to send more arms.
We need more weapons, heavy weapons.
Joining me to talk about this and two other big flashpoints in the world this week is Jack Keane. He's a retired four-star general and former Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He's now chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. General Keane, thank you so much for your time. How important is this Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson, and what could it actually achieve?
Yeah, well, I think it's actually the most critical phase of the war, other than the initial invasion that took place when the Russians tried to take the capital city of Kyiv and failed. This is a real opportunity for the Ukrainians to retake some of their territory. They have been planning this counteroffensive for weeks. The United States military has provided them at least some assistance in terms of thinking through the problem itself. They're in the preparation phase now, where they're attempting to shut down all the ground lines of communication, namely the bridges that lead into the city, so the city would be isolated. They've also taken some of the villages and small towns north of Kherson city as well. And the likely offensive to take the city itself is imminent. Now, we have to pause here a second and let our audience know that despite all the successes that the Ukrainians have had in stopping the Russians since the war began on February 24th, this is the first time that they've ever conducted an offensive operation against a well-defended urban area. And this is a large city of some 300,000 normally. While we give the Ukrainians a lot of credit, we just don't know, Andrew, how they're going to deal with this situation. We're hopeful and optimistic, to be sure, but it is critical if they're able to achieve it and have some momentum, given the fact that the Russians have struggled as a result of the progress they made in the eastern Donbass. The casualties are very significant, and they're having difficulty with their offensive movement, and that is why the Ukrainians are seizing the moment here. So this is a very critical phase. It'll help determine the outcome, I think, going forward, whether this war is going to lean towards Ukraine's favor, or is it going to lean towards a stalemate frozen in place, which clearly favors the Russians?
Why hasn't the Albanese government dragged this man, the Russian ambassador here, in for an official roasting for Russia's latest war crimes in Ukraine? Put the heat on him. Now, I'm not talking about the video of a Russian soldier castrating a Ukrainian prisoner with bolt cutters, but something, can you believe it, even worse? The massacre of more than 50 Ukrainian prisoners of war, dozens more injured. Now, Russia has blamed these deaths on Ukraine, saying it fired a missile at the prison using one of the American-supplied HIMARS launchers that have helped to turn the tide of the war. Now, that story is almost certainly a lie, as I'll now try to show you. This is the prison before the attack. The block with the Ukrainians is the white one in the centre. And this is the same scene after the alleged attack. It already doesn't look like a missile attack. Just look at the tin roof for a start. Mostly still there, not blown off, not shredded by shrapnel from an explosion below. Let me show you in contrast what a missile attack from a HIMARS or equivalent does look like. It leaves a big crater, and it also leaves an even solid building blasted to bits. But let's go back to this prison barracks. There, no crater to be seen. And the beds of the prisoners are barely moved. It's as if they were just burned in a fire. And that was, I think, exactly what happened. Russia locked the prisoners in the building and then fired it, burned them alive, tossed some sort of incendiary device inside. Now, if you think they wouldn't be that evil, remember that these prisoners are from the Azov Brigade battalion that held up the Russian advance from the south for critical months, fighting in the ruins of Mariupol before surrendering. The Russians were furious. They called these soldiers Nazis. And the Russian embassy in London just on the weekend tweeted, "These Azov militants deserve execution, but death not by firing squad, but by hanging, because they're not real soldiers. They deserve a humiliating death." It was so obvious. I said before the election this Albanese government would go soft on China. Well, no, said Anthony Albanese before the election. It'd be just as tough as the Morrison government.
The search for false distinctions between the government and the opposition on China is not in Australia's national interest. We have the same position on the South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and human rights abuses against the Uyghurs and Tibetans.
Well, today we found out all those assurances were false. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the US House of Representatives, this week flew into Taiwan for an official visit. Here is a video she's just released of her 2 days there, talking to its democratically elected leaders, talking about freedom, promising to help defend this island democracy from the Chinese dictatorship that threatens to invade it. Now, China's gone feral. It says this democracy is actually Chinese territory. It warned Pelosi not to go. There were even threats in the Chinese state media to shoot down her plane. Instead, China has now hit Taiwan with trade bans and surrounded the island with warships, holding live fire exercises, almost cutting it off. They're even threatening to fire missiles over Taiwan. Some of these exercise zones, these no-go zones, include Taiwanese waters. China also yesterday sent 27 warplanes into Taiwan's air identification zone. Some even crossed that line between Taiwan and China. You can see the coloured lines with the arrows showing their flight paths on the Taiwanese Defence Force map, how they flew into Taiwanese airspace. And these planes included the J-16 strike fighters armed with missiles. But to what sounded at first hearing, like a big victory for the United States. A US missile has killed the head of Al-QAEDA, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who took over the Islamist terrorist group after Osama bin Laden was killed a decade ago.
Now, justice has been delivered, and this terrorist leader is no more.
Now, Zawahiri was undoubtedly evil. Right? He was actually a paediatrician in Egypt. Oh, nice guy. In fact, he became an Islamist radical. He was arrested after Muslim radicals assassinated Egyptian President Anwar Sadat in 1981. But he was acquitted, and he later teamed up with Osama bin Laden and is accused of helping to plan Al-QAEDA's terror attacks in 1998 of US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and the 2001 terror attacks in the United States that killed around 3,000 people. So he deserved to die, and Biden, who looked really frail when he announced his kill, struggled to read his words, mangled his sentences, made a big claim in trying to sound tough.
Now we have eliminated the emir of Al-QAEDA. He will never again allow Afghanistan to become a terrorist safe haven, because he is gone, and we're going to make sure that nothing else happens. You know, it can't be a launching pad against the United States.
But wait a minute here. Zawahiri was actually assassinated in a house in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, in a nice area. A house reportedly linked to an advisor of the second in command of the Taliban government. So it sounds to me that Afghanistan is becoming a haven for terrorists. Maybe not quite that safe, but the Taliban is not just once more in charge of Afghanistan after Biden's disastrously rushed pullout of US troops, but is once more protecting Al-QAEDA and who knows who else. This is a story not just about how global warming is not producing the predicted disasters that the Albanese government claims as its excuse for its new global warming laws today. This is also about how telling the truth about this insane scare gets you persecuted, including by the ABC. I'm talking about news today that would have stunned anyone who takes the ABC seriously, who takes climate scientists seriously, who takes politicians and global warming activists seriously. The Great Barrier Reef, that they've told you for decades is being killed by global warming, actually now has record coral cover for most of its length. The Australian Institute of Marine Science says there's been a huge rise in coral cover in the northern reef and also in the central reef, and these are the parts of the reef that most tourists see. There was a small decline in the southern reef, but this wasn't because of global warming. It was largely because of the crown of thorns starfish. We can get on top of that if we just try harder. Now, this is an important moment, and I'm not surprised that papers like the Sydney Morning Herald virtually buried almost no mention of it. I was watching TV news bulletins, no mention of it, because this exposes the global warming hysterics who for decades have treated the reef as some kind of hostage, cut your emissions or the reef gets it. The Greens leader was at that game just yesterday.
The Great Barrier Reef will die, as will the 60,000 jobs that depend on it. More coal and gas mines will cause more floods, fires and droughts. They will increase the cost of living, destroy infrastructure, ecosystems will collapse, and more species will become extinct. And more of us will die.
Honestly, if these guys were right, the reef today would not have record coral cover. It would be a smoking ruin. Because how often have these people, Adam Band and the rest of them, claim the reef is dying, if not dead already? Here's just a tiny sample of this propaganda that's been going on for more than 2 decades. In 2000, for instance, Great Barrier Reef faces destruction within the next century. Fast forward to 2012, half the Great Barrier Reef will be gone in under 30 years. In 2014, Great Barrier Reef faced with irreversible damage. In 2016, the Great Barrier Reef half dead already, 93% bleached. And then next year, the reef is dying even faster than before. Last year, climate change, 99% of the reef could be wiped out by 2025. And this year, how the Great Barrier Reef is dying and why you should care. Now, I take the Prime Minister at his word that he wants a more civil parliament. I haven't actually seen it yet, but I believe he wants it. And I do worry about the disrespect in Parliament, the way the Greens, for instance, show no respect for our flags, refusing to fly the symbol of our unity next to the tribal Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags. I'm also appalled by their total disrespect for our Constitution and our monarch.
I, Sovereign Lydia Thorpe, do solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that I will be faithful and I bear true allegiance to the colonising Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Senator Thorpe.
And while I'm at it, I'm even disappointed that one of the Greens' newest members could not even show enough respect for the Parliament of the People today by putting on a tie. But this is just part of the general decay, of course. I mean, you got the Prime Minister on Saturday even insulting Australians by saying, "We've taught Aborigines to never expect some decency from the rest of us." I mean, seriously? But there were 2 more examples this week, one on Monday, one today, that shocked me because they came from people I expect much more from. Now, politicians should actually show, we don't have to, but politicians certainly should, they should show some respect for former Prime Ministers. Criticise them in debate, fine, but no cheap insults, no playing to the peanut gallery. Respect. But on Monday, our new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, cheapened himself by going on a Channel 10 quiz show. And he got this sneering question about former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He got it from a comedian and just played along with it.
I can see that you're in the lodge. Have you managed to get that Morrison smell out yet?
The exorcism has taken place.
That is beneath the dignity required of a Prime Minister who wants to unite this country. Then, this morning, Labor Minister Ed Husic went on ABC Radio and savaged another former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, for today writing an article arguing that the government's plan for an Aboriginal-only parliament was not just race-based but potentially dangerous. Husic went the smear.
It just goes to show you how far the semi-mighty have fallen further, because in Tony Abbott's case, I think one of the few things that people would have granted him is a few points on the fact that he would have engaged in this issue and genuinely tried to work with First Nations people, and it seems like that was just an act rather than substance.
I like Ed Husic, but that's disgusting.
I am deeply remorseful, and I'm trying to be remorseful without being ashamed of myself. Right? I'm human, and I made a mistake, and I'm trying not to think of myself as a piece of shit.
Daisy, here's my question about this apology, where it seemed to me that Will Smith's primary motive here was not to feel bad about himself. It wasn't to apologise to Chris Rock. It was to preserve his self, love. How can you be deeply remorseful for hitting Chris Rock in the face in front of a huge audience without feeling ashamed of yourself?
Yeah, it's a pretty weird apology video and a pretty strange sentiment, because the thing is, he should feel ashamed of himself. He should feel remorseful and ashamed of himself, because what he did was unbelievably shameful. And the thing about shame, Andrew, is that in the right dose, it's an incredibly constructive emotion, because it's a natural human incentive to not repeat the behaviour that you're feeling shameful about. So if he's trying not to feel ashamed of himself, well, he's kind of shooting himself in the foot in a funny sort of way. I don't know what weird kind of celebrity self-love thingy he might have going on, but that is not the way to atone for something he did that was incredibly wrong and totally unacceptable. And look, speaking, of Chris Rock, what a class act he still is. He moved on, he didn't make a fuss, he hasn't played the victim since then. And in fact, Andrew, he's been apparently mining the incident, at least indirectly, for comedy bits in his current world tour. And my favourite line that I have heard from him so far, I've got it written down. He said the other night, anyone who says words hurt has never been punched in the face.